Because we know that Christians and Jews lived in, under Islamic power, and we're told, in fact, that they lived relatively well. Is this true, the idea of Islamic tolerance and coexistence? Is this a reality?
No, it isn't. As long as a Muslim is not equal to a Christian and a Christian is not equal to a Muslim, how could be their tolerance? Even today, in those countries, a Christian cannot be a head of a department, cannot be the prime minister, cannot be the president. So where is the equality? What tolerance are you talking about, Michael?
I suppose what we would have in the West, where you could change your religion, you could abandon your religion, embrace another, even offend another religion.
So that is the notion of the tolerance that we accept. And in a civilized tolerance, but is this a civilized tolerance? A religion that claims to be a peaceful religion, a religion of peace, how could that be? That whosoever criticizes it or discards it for another religion or for no other faith would actually face a death sentence.
So those, let me put it another way, some would argue it's historical circumstance that the Muslim world, particularly the Arab world, feels disenfranchised and vulnerable, and so it's lashing out in a certain way in this point in its history. But in the past, Islam wasn't like this. It was more pluralistic, did allow free and open debate, university discussions and great libraries and so on.
When?
I think this would be said to be early medieval Europe, 13th century, 12th century.
We are not talking about what people did. It is all based in the Islamic manuals. It comes from the Quran and the Sunnah, the sources of Islamic Sharia. And if those sources declare these things, that this is not to be tolerated, a Jew and a Christian are not to be tolerated. They are tolerated in terms of on Islamic terms, meaning that they must be humiliated, they must accept that they are subjugated, they must accept that they are less people, they are subhuman to Muslims, that they have made a crime, they have committed a crime by refusing and rejecting the finality of Muhammad as the prophet of Islam and as the prophet of all religions. So your presentation of making Islam a tolerance and talking about the Middle Ages, it being tolerant, it is exactly compared to Saudi Arabia today. Because the Saudis import foreign workers, the Saudis who expelled after the death of Muhammad and the Khalifa expelled everybody, the Jews and the Christians, and now to have the Jews and the Christians come back into Saudi Arabia, the Hindus and the Buddhists to come back as subservient and to run the country, is that a sign of tolerance to you? There is a doctrine in Islam called the doctrine of darura, of necessity. لِلضَّرُورَ أَحْكَامٌ. Muhammad said, for necessity there are rules, and the necessity concept in Islam is, in the Islamic jurisprudence, is very well spread. And then there is a doctrine called Taysir, which doctrine says, Inna Allah yuridu bikum al-yusra wal al-usra. Allah wants to lighten your burden and does not want to burden you excessively. If that is the case, these two and other doctrines facilitate for the Islamic nations to incorporate people, to have them when they need them. They realized that they needed the Jews at that time, so they opened their borders, just as the Saudis now need the Western technology, Western expertise to run their country. Their petrol and everything else, their oil industries will come to a halt. Would that you call tolerance? I'm disappointed, Michael.
The question is, the difference between a Muslim state of theocracy such as Saudi Arabia and Iran and an ordinary Muslim person living, say, in Canada. Surely you can be a Muslim living in Canada and not have these views and actually believe in coexistence and pluralism.
I hope so.
Do you think so?
Well, are we discussing a subjective view of individual Muslims, or are we discussing what the text and what the religions say and what they have done? If we are attesting by history, then the tolerance is a myth. Just as the peace, that Islam is a religion of peace, is a myth.
Is it possible that Muslims living in the West could carve out a new reformed Islam that would embrace Western ideas of tolerance?
Reformed Islam, if by reformed you mean the Reformation as it took place in Europe among the Christians, that Reformation took place because they went back to the scriptures, they went back to the Bible. They discovered that man shall live by faith alone, and therefore they pushed out the papacy, and there was a reformation. When Islam will go back to its reformation, to go back to its script, to back to its text, what would find? They would find actually that they are living rather a loose life, and the laws and the harshness of it, that is what is exactly happening in Europe today. People are going back to Islam, and therefore there is a resurgence of Islam. They cannot reform it. Reform it in what? Who has the view of reformation? Islam cannot be reformed because it has been closed. It is a divine revelation, as Batior explained, and there is nobody that can add or remove from it.
So, this is fascinating. A more liberal, pluralistic Islam is a denial of the original text.
Yes.
The conclusions are quite terrifying then. You're saying that the more people who are Orthodox Muslim, the less we can have a pluralistic world.
That's true. Well, Mike, I would like to return back to the issue of the beauty in the Quran that you referred to. On what basis did you come to that conclusion?
I think there's some poetic and lyrical lines in the Quran.
What sort of a beauty when it says that men are and women are not equal, Islamizing and telling that the Jews and the Christians have turned and tampered their scriptures and falsifying history, that Abraham was a Muslim and not a Jew, Moses was a Muslim and not a Jew, and there is nothing called Judaism, that Christ was not crucified. Which part is beautiful here?
Sam, I believe people have a perfect right to believe, I think they're wrong, that Jesus wasn't crucified. I mean, you're painting a picture of something, you're almost coming back to an Islamic position here. People have a right to say those things. They don't have a right to call for others to be hurt, do they? But they have a right to their own view. They're not Christian.
They have their right to have their view, but when the other person who holds those views is termed as a kafir, as not only an unbeliever but an infidel and an apostate who is anti-Islamic, and this will translate into being punished, and it is a punishable crime, then the beauty disappears, whatever kind of lyric or poetic beauty there may be, because beauty and reality are two different things.
I think there's much beauty in the Old Testament, but I'm sure you would agree, you're a scholar, there are aspects of the Old Testament that can be quite chilling. There is genocide in the Old Testament. There are elements of the Old Testament that are quite brutal. We read it and we understand that there's a logic here, there's a history that can be quite bleak, but it's there.
Thank you for saying it, Michael, that it is a history. The Quran is not a history. It is a word of Allah, valid from eternity to eternity, and therefore applicable. So when the Quran says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَتَّخِذُوا الْيَهُودَ وَالنَّصَارَ أَوْلِيَاءً لَكُمْ, O you who have believed, do not take the Jews and the Christians as your friends and your protectors, and whosoever does is one of them. That is not limited to the time of Muhammad. When it says, لِتَجِدِنَّ أَشَدَّ النَّاسَ عَدَوَةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الْيَهُودُ وَالَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا, you'll find the worst of the enemies, the most venomous of the enemies of those who have believed, meaning Muslims, are the Jews and the polytheists, meaning also the Christians. If that is the case, this is valid for eternity, valid as long as mankind lives. Then if that is the case, this is not history. Thank you for saying that the Old Testament is history, because it is.
Sam, we've got about a minute and a quarter. Over to you. Anything you'd like to say to conclude?
Yes, as long as Muslims come here as individuals and human beings independent of their religion, as Batior put it, if they come to impose their Sharia, if they come to impose an Islamic system as a political system on Europe and on the rest of the Western world, then we would have a problem.
Don't most Muslims, as with most people who come to the West, what they're coming there for is safety, dignity, the chance to make a living for their children, to get a good education? Isn't that what most Muslims are in Canada and the United States for?
I don't know. We hope that it would be the case, but so far it has not. I mean, to a large majority, it looks like it, but what the new trends that we see emerging in the Western world is rather disappointing. It says actually the exact contrary, because when you look at it, the Sharia financing is introduced, the Islamic banking is introduced, the Sharia law is being demanded, the inequality, all of these, you see, is coming on in its droves.